Here we are. Welcome everyone to our special Facebook Live event reading today with Margaret B. Ingraham. And today we're so happy to have you with us, Margaret. Thank you so much for reading. Margaret's going to be reading from this, our most recent release from her at Paraclete Press, Exploring This Terrain. And just a little bit about Margaret for those who might not know her. Margaret B. Ingraham, a poet and photographer, was born in Atlanta, Georgia, and grew up exploring the woods behind her childhood home. She is the recipient of an Academy of American Poets Award, a Sam Reagan Prize, and numerous residential fellowships at the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. She has twice collaborated with composer Gary Davison, and she now lives in Alexandria, Virginia. Thank you so much for reading for us today, Margaret.
Thank you, Rachel, for this wonderful opportunity, and thank everyone who is joining us for taking time out either from a work day or a weekday in the middle of it to spend a little time with us this morning. You know, we've been inside for a long time, Rachel, haven't we?
We sure have.
We were online a year ago when this book first launched, and then very shortly after that, we went into sequester. And you know, it was in many ways a disorienting time. It still is for me. I sometimes wonder what day it is or what month it is, but I realized what hadn't been disoriented at all was the larger creation, if you will, the natural world. It just isn't confused. It just naturally and obediently goes about doing what it does and being what it is. And trees break into leaf and flowers bloom and birds make nests and all of those kinds of things. And so I look to that now, I think, kind of to get my moorings. And I think that that's reflected in my work, and I hope that it is. I want to just make reference to America Magazine, if I might, for a minute, that just published an issue that looked at books that they called Spirituality and Poetry, and they selected 11 books. I began reading from the top and saw names of people that were very well known, and then lo and behold, if you get down to number 10, you see Margaret B. Ingraham, Exploring This Terrain, and that's largely, I think, because of Paraclete. But in the review, the reviewer pulled out phrases from a number of my poems as those things, I guess, that grabbed him the most. And I'm going to thank him for that, because he did a job for me. One of the hardest things that poets do when they sit down to read is to decide which of the poems that they want to present to an audience. There are 70 poems in this book. Obviously, we're not going to read 70 of them today. But I went back and looked at the poems from which he pulled those phrases, and that's how I selected those today. So I'm going to read those. The book, I might say, is divided into 7 sections. He selected poems from 5 of those sections, and so I'll read those first and then end with one each from the 2 that he did not. So beginning with Evensong. Evensong. This far north, it is still South Holston water, clucking softly on the rocks, like a small coop of contented hens at roosting time. Deep in the circles of evening, all the leg-singing crickets gather on the shore to play new melodies with their knees. In these mountains, they say, you must always come alone to dance a summer polka to the Blue Ridge Crickets song. Now, from the section called All the Water Touches, is a poem called Ode to a Crossing Fox. This poem is probably the most formal poem of all in this section. It is in fact an ode. It's quatrains in iambic hexameter. I actually had the nerve to read this poem in front of Grace Schulman, the great poet Grace Schulman, who said, well, I guess every poet needs a roadkill poem. And so fulfilling that obligation, ode for a crossing fox. 4 days I passed along that spit of land between the ocean dunes and barriered sound, and saw him lying there. I thought him bound inland as tides, and yet he faced instead surely windward toward the coastal side. 4 days I passed. The first he seemed at rest, his coat still quick against the marshy grain. The second day, his flesh held tight as dream, as firm as sleep. His eyes remained yet deep. The third it was, the grackle came, walked wide about, but did not light. Then that night brought a rain that spanned the brim of the fourth day and left him changed. His skin as unrestrained as loose cadences of the wind that played from sea again across the slender bed the tender hands of grass had shaped for him. 4 days I passed alone and saw at last from my remove just how perfect stillness would prove the ease of time in taking him out of sleek posture and his sure intent, would move him out of fractured circumstance, above the place where danger always danced, would guide us both beyond what finally seemed the strange ungainliness of his decease, leading leeward over the finny plain of nesting plover, into thick forest cover, and west into the hinterland, boundless beyond the estuarine sound. Well, if every poet needs a roadkill poem, I'm told they also need a cemetery poem. And so here is my cemetery poem, Great Blue in the Cemetery. What brought you to this landlocked place of stones carved out rectangular and set down hard against a ground laced with thin coverlet of pine, needles shining fine as amber beneath a trace of late December frost? What kept you here to watch my annual return to this small lot from which I'm hewn, and still the only place for me to move alone through generations, left to right, husband, wife, father, mother, toward the pause by which my single plight will break not heart so much as perfect alternation? Surely none of that escaped the sliver pierce of your gold hair and eye. And yet you were not moved at all by that, or bite of season, or bitter wind the cloudless azure southern sky belied. From where you gravely stood on poker leg, you must have heard me speak their names, and must have watched me clear the plot and take in hand a year's full residue of twigs and cones and fallen bark, and sweep them off without my glove, and press my palm against ancestral stones to push away the cold that time insists to leave and rocks agree to hold. There, you were solitary witness to the solemn rite that I had thought I was observing fully out of sight of any other being. And yet seeing that is what made you wait my notice before you opened yourself up to flight, unfolded the great span of your blue wings that left fluttering in its wake all bound and weighted things, a marble angel tilted on headstone's crown, and me, bent down, whispering and chilled, and yearning to secure everything our visitations bring in all we take from such a strange winter meeting place. Also from this section, one more poem about the birds. I know at least one of my friends is watching who says, enough about the birds, Peggy, enough with the birds. Well, no, for me, there is never enough about the birds, but for others, obviously there is. So this is the last one, Crossing. It refers to a time in summer here, which we are not in, a drought-filled summer. And it seemed that the rains would never come. Crossing. Saturday, I went out early, hoping to save my ailing garden from the clutch of drought. And focused as I was on the parched leaves and the browning grasses, I still heard the whirring of the hummingbird as he made his easy passes between the limbs of maple and crabapple, and caught a quick iridescent flash before he darted behind the ash around the pine and climbed completely out of sight. Just before fall of dusk, it must have been, I went out again to look for summer clouds or any sign of rain. And at about the height I'd witnessed the hummers fading, I saw that one great blue heron moving without sound, deliberate and majestic, like some crown royalty, avian queen or king of the close realm of wetlands and of open air, crossing from here to there mysteriously. So it was that day's end, as at its beginning, that they appeared so gracefully above my small place of dust and dying shrub, a huge heron and a minute ruby throat, the greater and the lesser of the birds. Neither one expected, and neither one of them known either for sustenance or for song. And yet, that day, they were for me, both sweet manna on the wing and melody beyond any longing.
Margaret, your friends are commenting. Sally Thomas says, I will never say enough about the birds. And Enid Borden says, another bird poem? Okay, you are forgiven because you are so good at it.
Well, thanks to both of them. And thanks to both of them for being here. This poem was not one mentioned in America Magazine, but I want to read it because it is from a section that was overlooked, maybe overlooked, but it is a friend of mine, a wonderful friend of mine who's a writer, but is also a painter and has been concentrating on that lately, asked me a question. And this is how I answered it. Poet to painter. You ask me how one can paint the cries of seagulls. In the same way, I think I'd say, as one can pen the colors of morning or of night. How is always full of curiosity for me. It's in the why I find some certainty. You paint, I write, to move inside the mysteries of light. Back to the America selections. This poem I wrote after I heard, as we so often do, a news story of those small planes that crash in Alaska during blizzards that are so dense and dangerous that no one can go in for days or weeks or sometimes months to find those who, if at all, survived, just did for a little bit. It's called Lost in the Wilderness. What will you do until the snow is melted and the wilderness brightens and opens herself to landing? You cannot hide forever in the wreckage of your body. You cannot close your eyes and lose your wetness, your own dark wetness, which presses shadows deep into the frozen earth here at the crossroads of the empty wind. The thick Alaskan hill draws your body in next to her cold thigh, where you could be content to pour out all your secret life. But stop, and in your waning, commit to memory the path of drowsy snowflakes coming to rest, the bluing lines on your sad hands, the calculated flight of circling willow ptarmigans, slowly coming brown, the wolf in otter's tracks, the moon. Commit all to yourself. Lie down then in your aloneness and memorize the earth in all its ages and its coldness. Lock yourself into the rock of your freezing body into warmth. This one, again, selected by me from the section on animals who were overlooked, except I guess there were animals in all of those sections. This is not about birds, but about horses. It's called Witness. Beside the pasture this morning, I witnessed the anticipation of the one waiting horse turn to what seemed disappointment at the discovery of my empty hand, while the second small stallion watched content from behind the frosty nimbus of his breath, before they thundered off together, whinnying, to find satiety in new grass and withered shoot. Not harnessed by the question around which we so aimlessly trot, of how to make every desire our own private possession. For them, in their land of plenty, sufficiency is always a given, for what is given is sufficient. I've selected just one more. This will be the last one, and unless, because I hope that maybe we can have a dialogue and people can ask questions, but if not, or if they have others that they'd like to hear, I certainly would be happy to read. Again, the final poem in the book, entitled Venum Mysterium. It is all about light. The way it rises and it rests, the way it can distinguish a forest from its trees and dissect the delicate spaces between the limbs and leaves and put soft shadows down along the woodland floor. It is all about light. The way it seeks a silhouette, the way it can transform the rough and round to smooth and plain and create a clean horizon with the indelible stain that makes perspective black and white. It is all about light, the way it carries itself, the way the distant stellar beams, regardless of how slight, refuse to take their cover in the heavy shroud of night, the way even the smallest flame can push the darkness out. In the beginning, and in the end, it is all about light. I'll take my cues, Rachel, from you.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Well, we have lots of friends joining us and watching. Margaret Riccardelli says, lovely visuals. It's true. I feel that I can see every word that you speak. And I love that about your poetry, Margaret.
Thank you.
Gary Davison says that's one of his favorites. I was wondering if you might be willing to read the poem Ordinary Time.
Certainly.
Would that be okay? It's on page 21.
Thank you. I was going to have to look at the table of contents. 21.
For everybody who's here with us today, feel free to make a recommendation if you have the book in front of you.
Or to ask a question.
Or to ask a question, yes, thanks.
Ordinary Time, yes, I love this poem as well. And of course, Ordinary Time refers to a liturgical period of time. It's not a feast day or a holiday, as well as a double entendre here, Ordinary Time. Just as I lamented the cloud cover, the forecast for another rainy day, she chided me, said yesterday had been so glorious, not for lack of rain, though there'd been none, but because last week there'd come torrents to green the lawn and nudge the buds along. Just as I spoke, the sun emerged again, began almost proverbially another minuet with vernal fog. Its opening of the grand dance hall to the crowds of chirping passerines. And the groundhog I had not seen this month came scuttling happily along the perimeter of the tottering barn. In light like this, I question how to hold blessings such as these in trembling hands. Can barely understand as today ends in a pink-robed gloaming, where ordinary time concludes and season of bright gratitude begins. I have seen creation show itself pristine, and I know that it is good.
I love that poem.
Thank you.
Gary Davison says, it's always so melodic. And that's true. Margaret, when you're writing your poetry, how much work do you do out loud, reading the words out loud to hear them yourself?
A great deal. I think that I am driven as much by the ear as by the eye. And I want to say that to hear Gary Davison say it's melodic is a great, great compliment, because Gary Davison is a composer and an organist and a choir master. So thank you, and my friend. So thank you, Gary. Absolutely, driven by the ear as much as by the eye.
Sherry Page says that she loves this poem and the way that you read it. And Marilyn Turgeon says, what a wonderful gift. Well, Margaret, if there's another poem you'd like to read.
Sure. I mean, I can be very happy to read.
Maybe we should do one more before we close. There are comments coming in that I've read to you, not so many questions, but I think people are just happy for the opportunity to hear you.
Well, thank you. I'm happy for the opportunity to read. And we talked about being sequestered and being alone, and I haven't been entirely alone because I've been with my pup, Schroeder. I thought he might come join us. He did not, but I will read this poem also. It's about the seashore, if you will, one of my favorite places, but it's called Moving from Deep. Moving from deep, the ocean gust raises the flag of my small dog's tail, just as it plumes the heads of sea oats clinging to dunes, billows them both, as if there were no difference between what is new and impetuous in what is familiar and rooted, for it is neither this wind.
Beautiful. Here are two related questions. Both Enid and Sally are asking if you would speak about your favorite poets or the poets who have been important to you and made you want to write.
The poets that have been important to me. Well, I'll go way back, and I might even take an opportunity in answering that to read one more poem, if that's all right.
Please.
As a way to answer. It's called The Thrush of Mourning. And you'll see the name of one of them. And we can talk about that in a minute. But it's called, again, The Thrush of Mourning. In this 4th month's first day's new light, I walk the familiar path that is still damp with early mists, which seem forever reticent to dissipate and let the morning in. Just as they, I hesitate along the slope at the place the gravel footpath forks and listen a moment for the hidden thrush, although I know it's well ahead of the time for its migratory visit here. In that pause, I think of lonesome Keats, who named another season for these fogs, and of his nightingale, whose songs he heard, though bird he could not see. Disappointed that this dawn brings no melody or hint of morning song to me, I turn beneath my longing to discover in the lifting haze the season's recompense left last night under a starless cover. Delicate green stoles of finely knotted buds draped over grand Chinese elms' low boughs and curly willows' sloping shoulders. New leaves, waving hosannas in a secret breeze, ushering in the promise of days more lush than these, fuller hedges to hide the timid vireo, in pledge of dulcet notes more tuneful than ever the ancient dancing flutist piped. I keep this silence to myself, a quiet like the one Keats understood could make sheer mornings such as this seem bittersweet. Keats, yes, Keats. And Wordsworth.
Peggy, Enid has a follow-up question. She's asking, do you think that Amanda Gorman will create a new interest in poetry for younger people? And why do you think that poetry has sort of been misunderstood by so many? I guess it's a two-part question.
I absolutely do think that, and I was thrilled by her poetry and her poem, and how beautifully, by the way, she presented it. I mean, spoken word poetry has been a phenomenon recently, and she certainly did that with great charm and professionalism, and I absolutely believe that that's the case. I hope so. What was the second question?
Why do you think that poetry has been sort of misunderstood by so many?
I think poetry has been misunderstood by so many in part because of the way it has been taught. And as a former teacher myself, I hope that I did not contribute to that. People were always asked, and I can remember in my own classes as a student, I was always asked to analyze these poems and to look and find the deep meaning there, and what was it that the poet really meant to say instead of what the poem did say. And sometimes it's both. But sometimes, very frankly, it's just what the poet is saying. And I think it's really too bad that that has happened, that poetry has been made to be so difficult. And it seems to me that it's a burden that is imposed on this particular genre of art that is not imposed on others. We don't go and, when someone looks at a beautiful painting, we very rarely ask them to analyze what it means. They see beauty in it. And the same may be true of music and of all the arts. And yet poetry, for some reason, has been made hard. And there's a silliness in that, really, because poetry really was the first of all of the arts, if you will. And poetry was the thing that throughout history enabled history to be passed down. That's how we remembered those tales, because they were told to us in poetry. And we look at scripture too, the majority of scripture certainly is poetry. And not, I mean, we look first to the Psalms and say, oh yes, of course, the great poet David, the great psalmist, but look at the prophets and most of it. So I think it's just gotten a bad rap, and I'm glad that question got asked, because I hope that it will encourage people to stop trying so hard. Just read, listen, and look. Again, look at poetry. It is a visual art as much as it is a literary one.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, Margaret, we do have one more specific request.
Okay.
For the poem called Gradual Song, which I'm finding on page 116. A
little poem. A little big poem. Gradual Song. Wow. Also, I think this has probably particular relevance and resonance in a time of COVID, maybe. Gradual Song. I think it would be better if the death of things, of almost everything, of tree and dream and memory, of friendship and of love, were furious and sudden and not gradual as fall. Who requested that, may I ask?
Sherry Page. Gary Davison again says, like music, poetry lifted off of the page takes on its fuller existence. Thank you for reading, Peggy. And Sherry Page says it's been a splendid gift to us all. Kathleen Quinlan, I love that one, Peggy. I'm reading your comments, everyone, so that Peggy can just focus on reading her poetry, following along here. Wow, well, thank you so much for reading to us, for speaking with us, Margaret. Thank you to all of you for joining us in Facebook land, celebrating National Poetry Month, taking a quiet moment away with these words. It's almost like a little mini retreat in the middle of the day, Margaret. So I thank you personally for that too, for spending the time.
Well, thank you. And I just want to refer one more time to that America magazine and to the comment that the reviewer made. And he said that these poems revere nature simply because it is alive, and it is alive. And may we be ever blessed through that as we look out on it, and someday walk back in it freely and without fear.
Amen. Well, thank you, everyone. Here's this beautiful book. I hope it's not backwards for you. Exploring This Terrain. Such a beautiful collection and should be available at your local bookseller, which is always the first place we encourage you to go. But to celebrate National Poetry Month, if you would like to visit Paraclete Press and make sure you have a copy for your own library, you can use a special coupon code POETRY, and there will be a 20% discount for you. So hope you'll find a way to get a copy of this into your hands one way or the other so that you can savor these poems and remember Margaret's voice in your ears as you read. Thank you again, Margaret.
Thank you, Rachel, for the wonderful opportunity. And thank you all who were here. I couldn't see you, but I sensed you. And I appreciate you, for poetry is nothing without an audience.
Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.